All right. The highly coveted 5:30 time slot. So my name's Dan Ilson. I am a cloud solutions architect here with VMware. I work in the native public cloud advocacy group. So my group does not deal with any of the vSphere side of the house. We do native public cloud all the way through, Kubernetes and the service environment around it. That is what we do. So the chat today is about a newer service that we are bringing forward. It's based on a small acquisition we did at the very beginning of 2018, a small outfit out of Seattle called Cloud Choreo. We bought them, and they have put together a service offering for us that we're calling Secure State. And part of what Secure State is about here, as my lovely title somewhere behind my head suggests, is what we're looking for now is, from a security perspective in the public cloud, there are potential exposures configuration-wise that would not be noticeable normally by looking at the configuration of that one object in isolation, right? So for example, it's really easy to have an S3 bucket that you marked private that does not have a public endpoint, and yet depending on how the VPC that endpoint lives in is configured, it doesn't mean there's not a publicly accessible path to that bucket, to that RDS instance, to some other source of your data that you correctly configured to say, yeah, this is private. I don't want the rest of the world to be able to see this, except there's now an outside path by following the object relationships inside the public cloud to get there. And that's part of what Secure State is here to solve for and to help represent. And we're going to look at that a little bit here today. And then we're going to do the always entertaining live demonstration, where we see how the UI engineers have been playing with things while I've been away. So, some people will say the original version of this slide said security is harder in the public cloud. Security is different in the public cloud. It's not necessarily harder, but it is different. The shared responsibility model means that you have different things that you care about, as opposed to if you're doing these things in a data center you built and control, a colo, some other environment where you have control over the fundamental infrastructure. You have a very different set of concerns, right? You're worried about physical penetrations. You're worried about your gateway security, boundary security to the environment. In the public cloud, I'm not so concerned about those things. Thankfully, our friends at Amazon have taken a lot of that off of the table for me. But what I now have to worry about is data security, the policy I've set up. Am I enforcing that policy everywhere, or only in a few places where, admin A set it up correctly, but maybe admin team B or C let their standards slide a little bit last week, and so now we've got a couple VPCs where, I don't know. Have I had drift over time, right? I did it right the first time, but, and the app didn't really work right, and, Tim went in there and started pushing some buttons, and now all of a sudden, but I've got very legitimate config drift, and so when you get into, the sprawl of VPCs, regions, and accounts that most of us end up with, that turns into an exponential problem of trying to maintain any sort of consistency and order there against config drift, right? So, our little team of 6 people has this problem. So, our team of 6 people probably represents something like 20 some odd public cloud accounts at this point, maybe more, right? By the time you multiply the regions and VPCs or VNets that we're dealing with, that's, easily hundreds or thousands of potential environments that we now have to deal with, right? So, and then to top that off, you have these guys who stand up on stage to do a keynote and announce 18 new services in a day, and now there's a whole new API structure, relationship model that goes with that. I got to parse and sort through all that as well, right? So, and of course, that was my next slide, right? And how many of these do we recognize? How many of these did we know at one point and don't exist anymore, or have totally turned into something different, right? Happens all the time to all of us. So when we talk about Secure State, right? Real-time configuration monitoring and object relationship model, okay? So the very simplest version of this, it's configuration compliance and configuration assurance, right? But what makes this interesting is not looking at the individual object configuration, but the overall relationship map. And so there's an underlying data model to this that builds out that complete tree and says, I know that your VPC has an internet gateway, is connected to this routing table, is connected to a policy, and we'll look at some of that in here in a minute. And it lets you look at all this and say to yourself, okay, wow, okay, so this is bigger, this is broader. My potential exposure here is not object A, it's everything feasibly connected to object A or accessible with the same credentials as object A, which can be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of objects depending on how you're set up. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, it's vulnerability patterns across configuration, right? And so right now what we're looking at out of the box is the out of the box Amazon configuration compliance report and NIST's framework, right? Now we have some other frameworks we're going to add over time, as well as a custom rule, essentially a custom framework creation, to be able to say, well, my policy is X. I don't care about NIST, but I want you to check against mine, right? The NIST has 8,000 things I don't care about, but these 4 are absolutely critical, and I want to see them surface separately, okay? And then a reporting engine, obviously, to go around that. It's great if we can surface these things, but you're going to want to look at this on an ongoing, regular basis to guard against the drift and some of the other things, right? So, I kept this slide just for the image, because this is actually a very zoomed out version of part of the data model that underlies it. And so what we're looking at here is real-time creation, real-time change of configuration across objects, and how those affect the relationship map. And so if I bring up a new policy and I attach it to something, all of a sudden the effective neighbors of that object that the policy is on now change, right? And that all has to go out and get recomputated, either grafted onto or off of the relationship tree, and I want to be able to look at it that way. Okay, so I keep it just for this picture, because, for example, this cluster down here is actually the number of objects that go off of one RDS instance that we set up. And that's like an RDS instance with one EC2 instance that's drawing from it, plus policy, plus regions, plus internet gateways and other VPN gateways, et cetera. It exploded out into something that looks roughly like that. And then we zoomed way out so it looked pretty on a slide. So this will give you just a general idea of what some of our interface looks like. And again, we have a teaming concept. The whole point of the team concept is, I want to look at a functional grouping of people, whether that's a line of business, whether that's a project team, whether that's an app team, whatever that is. To you, that's how I want to be able to look at this thing. I don't necessarily care about Tim, even though I know he behaves poorly. I want to see what Tim's whole team is doing and how far he's drugged them all down. That's more important to us. But we're looking at that, again, on a Tim basis, on a tag basis across your inventory, if you're well tagged from a taxonomy perspective, or as I find out sometimes, and I think I'm well tagged from a taxonomy perspective, this will let me know, in fact, how not well tagged I am. Right, so again, from the frameworks we're looking at, it's SIS and NIST right now, adding a few more, and plus the cloud rules piece, right? So when we talk about this connected threat idea, and I'm trying to remember which corner of the slide I put it on, this is actually what we see. And we're going to go and look at something very similar to this in the actual UI right now. But essentially what we're looking at here is I have instances that all use the same key pair, okay? One of these instances has a policy that grants administrative access. The other 2 do not. Okay, but they're all in a publicly routable subnet. Are any of them effectively private? They don't know. They all have administrator access now, basically. Because all I have to do is get to the one that uses the same key pair, using the key pair that I already know, and I've effectively got administrator access to the whole environment, and I can do whatever I want. Again, not what was intended, and if you look at this instance, it'll look absolutely fine. But if you look at the overall picture, that's not ideal. And then off of here, what we don't show is, off of this route table association, the other subnets that exist, the other instances then that follow off of that, right? And the follow-on effect, which can be hundreds or thousands of objects, okay? One of the things that we get really nicely here, this obviously gives us a nice contextual view. The time to update this view is about 10 seconds, maybe a little less. So real time's always hard to actually guarantee. it's about close enough to real time that it would be you'd be hard pressed to notice an appreciable difference. If I'm within 10 seconds, by the time you've hit enter, looked around, and thought about what you've done, we should be on this graph. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I am actually going to cause all sorts of problems. And make the folks in the back really upset, and I'm going to go like this. So I am going to log in to my actual domain on the product. And we can show you guys what we're actually looking at. Please do not save my stuff. Okay. So this is our team's secure state instance, right? So this is the default board it drops me onto from a visibility perspective. So here I've got essentially my violating objects, which since I've got every framework turned on is all of them. You turn on enough frameworks, you are violating something everywhere, okay? And a lot of this is done on purpose. So I look at the total number of objects I have, the rules. So the rules would be, that'll depend on the number of frameworks that I'm actively looking at. In this case, I'm looking at both CIS and NIST, so I'm looking at two different rule sets. Essentially, I'm hitting just under 50% of the rules are hitting as violated. I'm passing slightly over half. So, considering where I used to be, I'm not doing bad. And then there's a severity scoring, right? And that severity scoring is coming from the frameworks themselves, right? So if SIS says it's a high priority severity vulnerability, that's what we're honoring that essentially at this point. When we get into custom frameworks and things, that'll now be incumbent on the user to say, hey, this is high for me, this is medium for me, this is low for me. Okay. And then, just some quick breakdowns on services and regions, right? But the nice part from here is I'm looking at all teams, and you can see we've kind of divided up into a few different teams. It's probably right behind my head, isn't it? We've divided up into a few different teams, right? And from these teams, we have different members, right? So we can look at those, we can slice and dice to get a little more specific, because looking at 800 and some violations is not particularly user-friendly all of the time, but it's nice to know they're all there. And then we have our dashboard, which is what we're on, our team board, which kind of drops us down into a little different view, and then we can slice and dice from here, just gives us a little more granular view. And our suppressions board. So our suppressions are, we don't have any configured in here, but they're essentially the violations that we've seen, we've acknowledged, and we really don't want to be bothered about anymore. Yeah, it's like, yes, I know, I'm supposed to use a better password, but it's a dev instance that's going to live for about 3 more days. Just go away and stop yelling at me. It's like the darn dinging noise in my car when I haven't immediately buckled my seatbelt, and I haven't even started it yet, and it's yelling at me. Same idea. So what I'm going to do now is actually, this is what our violations look like, right? So with our violations, we get some contextual information. So we get what the violation is, a little brief description of what it's supposed to represent to us, and that's coming from the name of the violation in the frameworks, right? So we're, again, honoring their information and their methodology. We get a severity, again, comes from the framework. So there's a risk score there, and I get asked about this a lot. The way we do risk score is not coming directly from the frameworks themselves. The risk score is based on essentially the blast radius of connected objects to the violating object, right? So if you have one instance by itself that's sitting alone in a VPC and doesn't talk to anything, you could mess it up 800 ways to Sunday, but you're going to get a bunch of high severity violations, but you'll get a risk score of like single digits, low teens, yellow. It's not so bad, right? Now, you could have a relatively minor violation, but you put it in a key RDS instance or a key S3 bucket that you write to every day and that a bunch of people have access to. It's going to show up in the 80s, 90s, bright red, horrible, we're all going to die, women and children first sort of scenario, right? So that's how we deal with that. For every rule, I can see the number of times it's been violated. I can see in what teams it's been violated, service, and when it's occurring, right? So we're going to look at one specifically. So I'm actually just going to go and I'm going to filter this. all of a sudden I'm down to one, almost certainly carefully chosen violation. So we're going to grab this guy, and so we've now grabbed the rule. Because we grabbed the rule, we're going to see the two instances where it's currently violated. And in grabbing those two instances, as you can see, even though they're the same violation, my risk scores are slightly different, and they're slightly different again because of the amount of connected objects to the violating object. I can see that my violating object is actually an internet gateway. It's an IGW, right? And if I want to actually bounce down into an individual instance, I will get the actual map of that violation. So, and then I can zoom in or out, and it draws somewhat interestingly, but I can kind of drag these around so we get a slightly more consolidated view. Anyway, what we get now is, so I've got a publicly routable instance that's sharing an SSH key with administrative instances, right? So, because it's publicly routable on the same key, I can now get from that publicly routable instance out to one that has administrative privileges and do whatever the heck I want. Not ideal. Now the violation is actually on the policy, and the policy resides with the internet gateway. So that's why we're seeing the violating object end up here, but then we've got context to all of these pieces down here. And if we click on those guys, we've changed the UI around a little bit, but we can get additional information here from those objects that are attached to the threat. So this is the chain that we're looking at. And then from in here, I can do a few different things, right? I can take this guy and I can suppress on either the violation itself, meaning I don't care about this rule, don't bother me about it again, even if it shows up 900 times. Or I can suppress it on the object that says this one is special. I still want to know when this rule is broken. I just don't care about this one time over here. I know Tim broke it. It's fine. We're used to the idea. Everything is okay. So I have those two options. I can also go out and file a ticket. You know, in our case, that runs a Jira ticket. You know, that's our idea. That's our methodology on doing it. Right now it's a Jira handler, but it could just as easily handle a different ticketing system if you guys have a way you want to surface that issue and report it through a pipeline, or we can share it out. And right now that's an email notification essentially with a link. Hey, go here, look at this thing. They click the link, log in, and it takes them right to the screen that we're on now, and they can see exactly what the problem is and decide how they want to deal with it. We haven't put it in the service yet, but there is a thought pattern here to potentially adding a little bit of an approval process, which basically says, hey, if you want to suppress this, like you can put it in that it should be suppressed, but security admin overseer has to go and say, yeah, that we're actually going to suppress that, or no, we still care about that. You're not allowed to do that, right? And so that's the view we look at there in terms of looking at a connected threat, actually seeing all of the context around it, and then being able to decide, okay, now how do we want to do this? So we are running a public beta on this service, and I'm actually going to flip back across to my lovely PowerPoint deck. So we're running a public beta on this service now, with an eye towards an initial availability launch of the service early in the next calendar year. Still working out exactly when, but the idea here, kind of the initial target profile is the folks that have a high public cloud density, have multiple teams out in the public cloud, and unsurprisingly, most of the initial traction has been with folks who are regulatory or highly compliance bound, your finance, your healthcare, your public sector, those sort of folks. They have the most direct requirements and liability attached to this stuff, so obviously it's top of mind for them. But the longer we go, especially with all the changes happening in Europe and some other parts of the world with regard to privacy regulations, frankly, I don't know how long any of us are really going to be able to get away with ignoring this. We may care about it more or less than some other people, but it's going to be a part of any of our lives that offer software or a public service at some point here. So we look at that. Again, complexity. The bigger, the more complex, the more users and the more divided they are, the more we find that this kind of message resonates, and the actual drift and assurance around all that configuration tends to matter. And then, as we look at like the mindset of what we're trying to do and like kind of the philosophical bent to it, this is a great tool right now from a first order visibility problem, and just being able to see, hey, what do I actually have? Can I be reasonably sure that I know what's there and how it's set up and that I'm doing what I say I'm supposed to be doing? But the second and third order problems become, okay, so once all of this is automation driven and the robots have taken over, I still want to have some mind that a person somewhere set a policy and the robots are behaving appropriately. And also, as I get into pipelining all this stuff out, there's actually a line of thought that some of our earlier customers are on that says, actually, I want my deployment pipelines to do a check against the service to say, I want to deploy X. Do I hit medium severe violations with a risk score of over 75? If I do, pipeline does not go forward, so-and-so gets an email, you go on the nasty list, and whatever sort of horrific punishments ensue are carried out appropriately. If we look at it that way, now it's still automation, but it's automation in a different way, right? It's kind of even a step beyond into a real deployment and development policy sort of angle. So that's where we're headed from there. And so I know I am the last person of the day, and I have ended just before I think they come and they sweep us all out with a stick. So thanks very much, guys. I'll be here for a couple minutes. If you have any more questions or want to look at it or potentially think you might want to look at the service, please let me know. Or Tim, who's also a member of my team who has not gone to the bar early and has come to listen to a talk I'm sure he's heard about 50 times at this point. But we'll be around for a few minutes. Love to talk to you, and enjoy the rest of your show. Thanks, everybody.